Yeah.
I'm calling to order the meeting of the Water Supply Planning Committee of the Monterey Peninsula Water Management District. It's November 4th, 2024. And let's do a roll call.
Director Eisenhart,
Here.
Director Oglesby, absent. Chair Paul.
Here.
Okay, we have 2 committee members present.
Okay. Before we go on to the action items, are there any comments from there? There are no attendees, are there?
Director Oglesby just arrived.
Oh, good, good. Okay, welcome, Mayor. We're just getting started. Glad
Okay.
glad you
And
could.
Chair Paul, correct, there are no members of the public in attendance.
Thank you. Okay, so all 3 committee members are now present. There's no attendees from the public, so we can move to our action items. The first one is adoption of the minutes from the September 4th committee meeting. Any corrections?
No corrections, but just a comment. I'm really glad that Director Oglesby is here, because I sort of have a personal policy not to abstain rather on approving minutes when I wasn't at the last meeting, and I wasn't. So now that we have Director Oglesby, I feel pretty good about abstaining. So that was my comment.
Okay. Well, I am going to move to adopt the minutes.
Second.
Okay, and I guess we have to do a roll call.
Yes. Director Oglesby,
Aye.
Director Eisenhart,
Abstain.
Chair Paul.
Yes,
Minutes are adopted
with one
2
abstention.
votes and 1 one abstained.
Okay, moving on. The Marina Coast Water District injection item number 2.
Yeah, and this is purely an informational item, but I think it's important to start to get the story out there a little bit. And I can tell you, Rem Scherzinger kind of jumped our mutually agreed upon gun on by going ahead and meeting with the Water Masters ad hoc committee on water replenishment on October 7th. But it's okay, because we've been having conversations and kind of haven't fully daylighted those conversations. So I think it's good to get it out there. But the idea is that Marina Coast Water District is very interested in being able to inject and store water, kind of in advance of them building any sort of ASR program of their own up at Armstrong Ranch, which is something they're also contemplating, but they have no plans for right now. And so
where would the water come from for that project?
Right. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So they've got two potential concepts. One would be, and this is in the staff notes, so I'm just going to touch on the regular injection for their own recovery, or injection for replenishment, also known as, replenishment water, but also, John, what's our term for the additional replenishment water?
So water to meet the protected water levels.
Protected water levels. Thank you. Thank you. So injection for their own recovery would be where they're basically seeking permission to put either their municipal water, which is produced by their own wells, in effect, bring it all the way over to CSUMB, which they serve, Seaside Highlands, which they serve, get it up into one of their pipelines in General Jim Moore Boulevard, and with a very minor amount of new plumbing, they could deliver that water to us, the district, for injection. And bear in mind, right now we have injection wells 1 and 2, Santa Margarita injection wells 1 and 2, which are only used in the winter for injection. So we would have surplus capacity in the summer months. The other concept is they are currently receiving what they call RUAP water, which is recycled water for delivery to the golf courses, Bayonet and Black Horse, but they have a surplus under their water right or their recycled water right. They haven't fully built out to irrigate the Dunes Shopping Center and then some of the new housing developments, nor CSUMB. So while waiting to fully build out those distribution systems, they could potentially take surplus recycled water from the Pure Water Monterey facility and inject that. That would have to be injected in the existing injection wells. And there's some issues with that, which we'll touch on briefly. If they were to inject for recovery, they would want a 1-to-1 recovery rate. You know, what gallon goes in, a gallon comes out. Injection for replenishment would be injection for long-term protective water levels and replenishment. You know, Cal-Am has a replenishment obligation as one example. The Water Master and its consultants have identified potential need for protective water level water, which would be another form of a replenishment need. But they've not yet figured out how to pay for it. The injection options, I mentioned municipal supply would come to us, recycled water would go to the pure water injection wells. On that one, I think a lot of work would have to be done on potential impacts on the travel time, the log removal on viruses, and a whole bunch of other issues just on, you know, kind of impact on standard operations of the Pure Water Monterey project. And they'd have to negotiate the use of quote unquote surplus injection well capacity. And I can tell you right now, there's some friction between Marina Coast Water District and Monterey One Water over some other issues, capacity in the conveyance pipeline, access through Marina Coast Water District property for the expansion project and so forth. So I'm not optimistic that that concept can be solved very quickly. Then there was some additional discussion about, and this was as a result of a question, I think by Paul Bruno, about a leave behind, which has been, it's reared its head before about, well, why don't we tax storers of water in the basin? Why don't we require a 10% leave behind or tax that then has to stay in the basin, and that in and of itself becomes a funding mechanism because they would get for free a 10% leave behind. It's anathema to our existing water purchase agreement and the amended and restated water purchase agreement. And most of the storage agreements that have been contemplated or mentioned in the adjudication never envisioned a leave behind or a tax. And unfortunately, during this ad hoc committee meeting, Rem Scherzinger made it sound like, oh yeah, it happens all the time. But unfortunately, too many of the examples are water banks in the Central Valley where the leave behind was actually a negotiating ploy for the resident pumpers to gain greater access to water for their pumping purposes. And so it was very easy to say to Metwater in the LA basin, yeah, you can use our Kern River water bank for storage, but for every 100 acre feet, you can only withdraw 90 acre feet and the remaining 10 go to the benefit of the basin. Well, that benefit isn't typically to combat seawater intrusion, nor is it to build up the aquifer over the long run. More often than not, it just becomes available water for the local growers to use in irrigation. And so this idea of a leave behind may or may not have relevance in the setting that we have out here, especially since there's no evidence of seawater intrusion yet. And so it would be an aspirational environmental leave behind, but not an actual proven to be needed leave behind. So anyway, that concept was out there, which at this point in time, I don't think has really good legs to stand on. But the rest of the staff note is pretty descriptive. And I just wanted it out in front so that you know that these conversations are starting. I can tell you that, and Mayor, you might be able to shed some light on this. There was communication between the City of Seaside and Marina Coast Water District about this type of concept. So not everybody's on board yet, I would say, was the tenor of that correspondence, but Marina Coast Water District has not responded to that letter yet, so can't really say much about it. And with that, any discussion or further questions?
I have some questions, but Mayor Oglesby, did you want to add something before I state my
No,
question?
Any comments?
Okay. Well, I'm missing a few pieces to really understand what's going on. What's driving this? It sounds like it's not really, that hasn't risen to the level of an actual proposal, but it seems like it's in the exploratory phase.
Right. Yeah.
What is driving this?
Well, there's two different drivers, possibly three. One is that a couple studies have been done, and John could weigh in on this if you want to hear more, but a couple studies have been done about protective water levels and where you can get the most bang for your buck by injecting near the coast versus more inland. And the idea of protective water levels stems from, we know there's a deficit in this basin. We suspect that if pumping in continued unchecked, then the head or the pressure from ocean water would be greater than the pressure from domestic water in the aquifer, and seawater would start intruding in.
Yeah.
And there may be some line out there, but it's still offshore. So we don't have any identified point where it's known, at least, certainly for the Santa Margarita, which is where most of the water comes and goes from, that there's a seawater intrusion front anywhere out there. So theoretically, there could benefit the basin by creating protective water levels. Unfortunately, Paul Bruno grabbed onto that concept really hard at one point to say, well, that's why we need a desalination plant. And that came at a time where the 6.4 million gallon per day desalination plant was starting to exhibit a lot of surplus capacity because of the declining demand for, how much do we really need? And so they were coming up with new ideas to leverage the same plant. So that's where one of the points of pressure came. The second is there were some bilateral discussions between Marina Coast Water District and the City of Monterey. And City of Monterey was trying to figure out how to jumpstart some projects like the Garden Road, different housing projects. And even I at one point had whispered a little tweet to Rem's ear, and I think he and Hans Uslar kind of independently had the same discussion, which is if Marina Coast has surplus water for a short period of time, could it be picked up and wheeled by Cal-Am for delivery to the City of Monterey on an interim basis until the cease and desist order could be lifted and you could set a new meter? And so conceptually, there was, how could we do this? And I said, look, that's not much different than the Ascent project, where the city of Seaside is using its stored water credits to kind of bridge until the moratorium's lifted and there's an allocation, and Cal-Am water can be substituted for that. It's not that different than what we have done for Montage and others by wheeling water from another producer to, in this case, DVO, for example, the developer of the Target and so forth in Sand City. So wheeling on an interim basis was something that we were like, yeah, we'd be interested in helping you out with that. And then the third impetus is, and you could get into a long conversation between Landwatch and Marina Coast over this, but Marina Coast believes it has wet water from its Fort Ord allocation. And as an example, they've got 65 acre-feet dedicated to City of Monterey purposes on the old Fort Ord. They've got a certain amount dedicated to Delray Oaks on the old Fort Ord. And neither of those are starting to build anything yet. And so Marina Coast Water District said, well, shoot, if we can produce that water, why don't we produce it, inject it, store it, and then we're building up stored water credits kind of conceptually of their own in advance of any construction. And, not a bad idea. The issue that Marina Coast has is they do not have extraction capacity in the area, and we cannot offer them any. So they would be injecting. I said, well, you need to solve how you're going to get it out. And one of the responses was, well, we'll solve that battle when we get to it, meaning they could locate a new extraction well. They could maybe participate jointly with the city of Seaside on their municipal system replacement well, maybe expand the capacity there. Or one thing that had been mentioned, which is not actually possible, Rem used the term a temporal reservoir, where he would store his own municipal supply through injection using our wells to the Santa Margarita, and then it would flow back to the 400-foot and 180-foot aquifers up in their basin area. But the two really don't meet. There's a hydraulic divide between them, and so it's a concept that doesn't really work. So you'd have to figure out, obviously, how to recover his stored water, if that's what his goal is. If it was simply replenishment water that's going to stay in the basin, then that's not difficult. But I think what's difficult there is to really make a dent. You can't just simply rely on us offering up injection well capacity at ASR 1 and 2. And even if we do, we're going to have to develop an O&M agreement so that we're compensated for any power and manpower and regulatory work, anything that we have to do. So it's purely just an idea without a lot of meat on the bones at this point.
Okay. It is on the replenishment aspect of this. Is it correct that the production limitations imposed by the adjudication decision are insufficient to protect against seawater intrusion?
Well, that's a great question for John. In theory, the answer is no one really knows, but that's probably where the next level of study goes.
Yeah, I could maybe add a little bit of that. There was a component of the adjudication decision that requires a payback, which Cal-Am has indicated previously is going to be an in lieu payback. So stopping of pumping 700 acre feet for 25 years is the initial proposal. It'll probably have to be revisited by the time the actual payback starts. But it'll be somewhat on that order of magnitude. We've done some groundwater modeling of what that would look like in the Seaside Basin, and it does not achieve the protective water levels, which are water levels that are set at selected monitor wells that exist on the coast, that were developed at the inception of the Water Master. And the idea of the protective water levels are, if you could get water levels in these wells up to these levels, you would not incur seawater intrusion, even if the levels behind the wells in the eastern side of the basin were below those levels. So they would kind of be a protective barrier against seawater intrusion. So that's where Dave was talking about whether you inject in the back of the basin or the front of the basin makes a difference physically on how you build up these water levels. But what is known is that the payback itself will not achieve the protective water levels.
But to the other
Yeah.
point in Director Paul's question, even today, do we believe that the triennial step downs that were made as a result of the adjudication, that physical solution actually solves the problem? And I think that there's been some questioning of that, whether it was enough.
Hmm.
So
Yes, there has been some questioning and possible revisiting. The Seaside adjudication decision states that the natural safe yield of the Seaside Basin is 3,000 acre-feet, and there's, now that we've stepped down and are at the 3,000 acre-feet, there is some question of, is it maybe somewhat smaller than that amount?
and on the idea of replenishment just for replenishment's sake, so ignoring, temporary storage and recovery, one of the things I personally, professionally feel that the Water Master hasn't done an adequate job of is to say, okay, if we want to make a program out of replenishing and buying replenishment water under the assumption that it's going to be made available, what infrastructure is needed and where is it needed and what might it cost? There's really three aspects to this. One is how would the Water Master pay for replenishment water? And they're doing quite a bit of thinking about that. But on the how would you actually do it question, I think Bob Jakes too often jumps to the conclusion that all of the existing injecting facilities, Pure Water Monterey, Aquifer Storage and Recovery, have capacity available for the purpose of replenishment purchases. And that's not clear that there is. The Water Master should be saying what additional wells should be needed. And then the consultants have also said, you do so much better if you inject along the coastal corridor than if you inject further inland. And perhaps there needs to be some work done to say, well, how many wells at what locations with how much pipe would require less water if configured this way versus how many additional wells and how much surplus capacity is there, and how much pipe could we save if we focus in on the general Jim Moore area. And none of that infrastructure planning has been done. It hasn't been thought about. So
and I assume you raised this point at the meeting with the ad hoc committee or somewhere else.
Somewhere else, I've raised that point
Yeah.
in the past.
Okay.
And then kind of related but tangential to this is the term leakage. And this is where the additional modeling that the same modeler who works for the Water Master did, but where we now know that it's kind of what happens at the political boundary versus what happens at the hydrogeologic boundary. So you've got a couple of members of the Water Master who say, well, we know we have a leakage problem. We need to fix this and begin right away. let's go buy replenishment water to take care of that, even though we know we'll be losing a portion of it. And then you have this late breaking, just a few months ago, modeling work that said, well, there's really not leakage unless you're just looking at the political boundary, not the hydrogeologic boundary. So
Yes, and I remember John's really excellent
yeah.
presentation to the board about that. That was quite interesting. So the leakage was really sort of an illusion, you could say, and not a useful description of what was going on.
Well,
Okay.
and if I just jump in, I mean, just
Yes,
under,
please.
thank you, under the category of, this seems like a bit of a daunting task, right? By Marina Coast. I mean, I'm looking at the one of the last paragraphs of the
Memo?
the memo, staff memo. And I mean, maybe Michael would know more about this, but it says here that the court didn't expressly authorize a non-party to store in the basin. And we're saying, well, but that could be overcome. We haven't talked about that. I mean, how realistic is that the language of the order can be addressed through submitting an application? I mean, I don't even know.
Yeah, and before Michael responds, and I'm not sure it's
Brand
necessary,
designs.
because the idea that the water master could embrace a third party as long as there's no harm is one at the discretion of the water master, I think. But the court itself ruled that our interests as the water district were not affected, and that our right to store water was
Is it
unaffected.
the statute? It's right.
And so we could put our left hand out to Marina Coast Water District, accept their water and use our water storage rights, and put it in the ground with our right hand. Our preference would be everybody embraces it, and we do a normal storage and recovery agreement and report it to the water master and so forth. But there is that avenue. But certainly Marina Coast Water District itself would need help from somebody else.
Eva, I have a question on the water that is coming from Marina Coast. Is that from, I'll call it Salinas Basin, and would be contrary to the county ordinance about exportation of water?
Well, so funny thing, the Agency Act carved out the old Fort Ord. And so water could be delivered to any use by the Department of Defense on the old Fort Ord, or not by the Department of Defense, but could be put to use in the boundary of the old Fort Ord, for one.
But when you said the 180 or the 400, those are generally associated with the Salinas Valley.
Right.
Not associated with Seaside Basin, at least from, our water source.
Correct.
So my question is how?
So the prohibition on export.
Yeah.
And it gets a little more nuanced, but it said any of the old Fort Ord was included in the definition of non-export. So in other words, if they delivered it to actually, if our ASR well, which is in the old Fort Ord, seemingly qualifies as not being exported from the basin, number one. And number two, I've either been told or I've read, and I can't remember where, that no, it actually extends even further, that they could deliver water to the Presidio if they wanted to, all the way down in New Monterey. But anyway, there's that has to be looked at. That it's the agency act that created, Monterey County Water Resource Agency. Yes, does have that export limitation, but the way it's defined appears to be not as rigid as one might think.
All right, so many questions that would need to to be worked on. So I appreciate your letting us know this is going on, and I guess if there are any more developments, please let us know. Mark or Ian, do you have questions or comments? No?
No.
Okay, so that was an informational item, yes?
Yes, indeed.
And we can go on to the supply and demand item.
Which is also purely for discussion. However, it's relevant because of claims we're making and claims that have been made in the phase 2 proceeding of the Public Utilities Commission. So I'm going to just briefly share the exhibit to the staff report on this one. So here is one of the slides that actually was presented to you at the full board meeting on the 21st. And, we say, well, how much water is there? And we have identify all of our supply sources. How much is available on a typical year, and add them all up. And we said there's 12,116 acre feet. Our two biggest areas of criticism have been on the Pure Water Monterey expansion, where Cal-Am has said, oh, wait a minute, in a drought year, this is worth only 0 to 1,100 acre feet. And Aquifer Storage and Recovery, they said, oh, here we got a memorandum that says with a 90% certainty over a 5-year period, the most you're going to be able to inject in any one year is going to be 471 or 470 acre feet. What that did at the Public Utilities Commission is align 5 interveners on one side of the supply and demand equation and Cal-Am over on the other side of the supply and demand equation. But their supporters here in the local community have glommed on to, well, those two resources aren't viable in a drought. Monterey One Water has come back and said, well, wait a minute. Pure water expansion is nowhere near 0 ever. It's 1,905 acre feet to 2,250 acre feet, even in a drought. So much more sensible and higher reliability in the expansion. And we've said, hey, wait a minute, Cal-Am's own data presented in this memorandum for the 59-year hydrologic cycle shows an average availability per year of 1,210 acre feet. So what do you mean by 470? And so this memorandum that you have just digs into those two resources and why there was a disconnect. Mm-hmm. Well, as part of the allocation process, we are saying, here's how much you have. And then we go on to say, here's how much we use. So therefore, how much you have minus how much you use is how much is available, factor of safety held back. Here's how much water we are now allocating. Mm-hmm. And so if any of our assumptions in the supply side were provably false, if we were really the guilty party of misestimation, then our whole allocation process would be affected. So I just thought it was an opportune time for us to just put into the record, at least on the supply sides, and this is not talking about future demand and overcounting, double counting, or triple counting demand, that we're highly confident on our supply side analysis of what's available. On the ASR side, long-term availability of ASR is affected by how much storage you start with. So if you took those 59 years of data and you line them up in the 59 years they actually occurred, that's one thing. If you randomize them, that's a different hydrologic cycle with the same data. Or if you reorder them and move 5 drought years up to the very first year, so you start in drought, well, your long-term average doesn't help you if you start in drought. So we analyzed various scenarios of, well, how much would you need in storage if you started in a 5-year drought? And I can tell you that in all of our simulations, where we are today with our 3,200 acre feet of ASR in storage, we have enough storage that the long-term averages should apply even if we were to start in a 5-year drought. Doesn't mean we will, but anyway, our method of analysis of those long-term averages does consider storage. Their expert witness said, oh, I was never asked to look at carryover storage. Well, fundamental flaw that, you know, completely undermines their use of their own data. So we think we're good there. That idea of holding back 1,000 acre feet on the allocation process anyway was also designed to give us a little head start. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's start injecting the Pure Water Monterey additional water. We know there will be a surplus. We know that will build storage as well. So all of these impacts of storage do matter. And in all of the analysis that CalAm put forward in the phase 2 testimony, they ignored storage. And, you know, that's just an unfortunate difference in approach. But, you know, Water 101, Water Planning 101 includes storage. So, but that was the purpose of this. The secondary purpose of this staff report was, as I told Fran on the phone, I said, well, it's the cross-examination we never really got, because we know what was said in testimony, but people who aren't privy to the PUC process have no idea. And there are folks around here who, you know, pen letters that say, oh, there's some question as to the viability of that supply. You know, district might be overcounting supply. And then ultimately, if we have to carry the same arguments up to the state water board, it's just nice to have some documentation out in the record, which is why I put it out there now.
Okay, no, I understand. Questions from committee members or?
Well, and I'm assuming it's not too late to be submitting that now.
Well, in the phase 2, it is too late. So what we're doing right now is just kind of submitting it for the benefit of the public or the benefit of any of these associations that I've been presenting to, or the benefit of a city council member who says, well, my sources tell me that you're overstating the supply. Well, no, we're not. You know, it's an honest difference of opinion.
The case was submitted a long time ago. We've been waiting for a long time for a decision.
Right.
But, you know, most people aren't going to read the testimony and the transcript of cross-examination.
Well, it's funny, Karen, you and Fran will get a kick out of this because almost a year ago, Lorianne Dolquist said, oh, there's no reason to update now that another water year has passed because that data really has no import. And here we are now, another year where another water year has passed, and we saw a reduction of demand again by 146 acre feet. And, you know, I almost felt like we should file a take notice filing of the new water year results because it just, you know, Lori was wrong. That year was a reduction of about 150 acre feet. Now we have another one. So all told, we're 300 acre feet in total demand lower than where she claimed on CalAm's behalf that there was no need to update anything. So.
Well, but how effective would that be?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, they've already, somewhere in the bowels of the PUC is a already drafted proposed decision that just is probably hung up on politics or how do you cover yourself when you realize there's $100 million mistake hanging out in the breeze.
Or more than 100 million.
Do we have
Madam
any?
Chair, if I may,
Fran?
Mark, the figures you see on the PowerPoint Exhibit 3A, those basically are in our testimony and in our final briefs that were submitted for the record. Everybody may have had, a slight different number on some of these, but Marina Coast, City of Marina, and MPWMD all came in with, within a couple 100 acre feet as to, yeah, we've got more than enough water here. We don't need your desalination plant. So, and the same with Cal Advocates, even though they show us needing water sooner on some of these major figures. I mean, they agreed with the 3376, the Seaside Basin, Pure Water Monterey. I don't believe they had any deduction, Dave, for the expansion.
Mm-mm.
I don't know. So I think they may have on Sand City. They may not have recognized Wheel Water, but I mean, it all came out very close to each other, except for Cal-Am. Cal-Am minimized everything.
Well,
Anybody-
and not to get too deep into it, but on the demand side, we probably hurt our argument a little bit because in that analysis, I used the 10-year average, thinking that Cal-Am was going to reinforce needing to use a 10-year average and that it would matter as a question of consistency, but they never really pushed on that. And so our numbers would have looked even better if we used the 5-year recent average. But
we were criticized in the last go round for using a shorter average. And so I think it was prudent to use the 10-year, which is their general standard. But the important thing is, I mean, you've got more than 2 or 3 decades where you show this continuous decline. And the bottom line is, it's primarily the cost now that it doesn't matter. I mean, yes, people still try to conserve, but a lot of the conservation is based on the cost of the water.
yeah,
Because the price that they're paying for even limited amounts is extremely high. And that's not going to change, So
that's it. Just trying to keep this committee abreast of what's going on.
Do we think we'll get a
Thank
decision
you,
this year?
Fran.
Yeah, so Fran, I don't know if you heard Mark's question, but do you think we'll get a decision this year? I think the answer is yes.
right now they have extended the statutory period, but only to December 31st. And if they follow their normal procedure, we would have to see a proposed decision on or about, I think, November the 7th to make the December 5th
Business
commission meeting. So the chances are the next thing we will see will be another proposal by the administrative law judge to extend the time. And probably go out to March or June. And the other thing is, they may be curious as to what's happening at the State Water Resources Control Board in the lawsuit brought by Marina Coast and City of Marina, and whether Cal-Am actually has water rights for their proposed desal plant. And we may learn something about that. The last thing our friends at Marina Coast were told was possibly first week in November. And that will be significant. It goes back to Judge Wills. for him to then proceed with an evidentiary hearing. But he had sent it up to the State Water Board because the determination of the water rights is within their wheelhouse, and he wasn't about to do that. They've had several years of technical analysis, and from what I've been told, significantly different from what was presented as part of the environmental documentation in support of Cal-Am's desalination facility. So a lot of moving parts. All I can say is stay tuned. As soon as we know anything, you will know something. We will pass it along immediately. So
Good, thank you. I can't wait. Thank you, Fran.
It feels like next year, I think.
Yeah, the only thing I could tell you is that if they've worked hard on a proposed decision and if they're close, a lot of times they like to clear the desk before the holiday. And so you get a PD that comes out that first or second week of December. They go, there, my desk is clear. And we've been in a couple of proceedings where you get a December PD. But if this one is as politically charged and there's nervous parties as there might be, then Fran's probably right. They'll do another statutory extension and kick the can down the road.
Just remind you, Mark, that there was an extensive round of lobbying back in the summer, in July, August, that Cal-Am started, even though normally the lobbying picks up when a proposed decision comes out, but no proposed decision, and Cal-Am started lobbying before. So that tells you they have a lot riding on this. And we in Marina Coast also went in to present our view of the supply and demand testing facts analysis also.
Yeah, I mean, my concern is, and this is my last comment, I guess, is, if I mean, even under a 10-year average analysis, and that you could arguably start distinguishing things, if the PD comes out on the supply and demand issue, hotly contested, south for us, I mean, I don't like the way that that's going to be a new benchmark for some period of time. That part is, it's
Yeah, if we get an adverse opinion, or if we get a just gray fog of an opinion, I think we change our message to the State Water Board that the pure water Monterey expansion is clearly a successful bridge to desal, and then focus in on we haven't been in violation for 4 years, and we've got enough surplus water for the next 10 years while desal is coming online, to the extent Cal-Am can successfully bring it forward. You shouldn't penalize us and make us wait for that project to come online if this project has enough surplus to get us there.
Mhm.
And then if we're not getting there, then relook at it 10 years from now. But I think that'll be our new storyline, which is it's now the bridge to desal. But again, only if we get that inconclusive opinion in this PUC proceeding. So, which is kind of why I'd like to see it before we go to the state board. And a week ago, Eric Ekdahl at the state board said, so when are you going to come see us? And that's because previously I told him at the end of this year, but we talked about the nexus between the PUC decision, or at least a proposed decision, and knowing what we want to know. And, he's made it clear they don't want to do the numbers. They prefer the PUC to have done the numbers.
And the Coastal Commission is also waiting
Yeah.
for those numbers.
Yep.
The coastal permit rides on a decision on this issue
does.
from the PUC.
And is there any what interplay here with everything we're talking about and what Judge Wills has before him?
Well, yes, sort of. So there were
You,
final reply briefs due to it's called the hearing officer at the State Water Board. And there were final briefs due, as well as the hearing officer opened it up to both CalAm and the Marina Coast to draft proposed language to go into the hearing officer's ruling to go back to the Superior Court. So both parties made their, they had done their opening briefs, and their opening briefs, CalAm's focused more on this is just a disgruntled water district that's unhappy about the desal and will stop at no cost to end it. Marina Coast was very technical on groundwater issues and the Lone Star water right of 500 acre-feet. And then their proposed language kind of reflected the same mentality. Marina Coast and City of Marina is very technically oriented. CalAm was very spilt milk, old grudges. There's no support. The PUC's already analyzed these issues, that kind of thing. But there had been interim discussions with the hearing officer where it was recognized by the modelers. So they also had this whole regime where each side could ask the modelers to do work, and they would have to agree with each other that the modelers addressed the question that each side wanted addressed, and so forth. And kind of midway in this whole process, there was preliminary results by the modelers who said, as soon as you turn this desal plant on, you're going to have deleterious effects on the groundwater. To which the first reaction is, well, then how can you even do this project under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, SGMA? But there are other things. So the pins and needles that everyone's waiting on is, what did the hearing office really write as technical direction back to the Superior Court? And so that lands in Judge Wills's courtroom. So yeah, there's definitely a relationship, because if there are groundwater impacts, or if they determine that the agreement with Lone Star that was done 30 years ago does in fact limit the off-site movement of water to 500 acre-feet, or even if they buy into the return flow argument of desalinated water, if the groundwater impacts are indicating a higher percentage of salinity than previous, it might exceed the 500. All of these things can just kind of cascade into, based on groundwater impacts, you cannot do this project. So it would be a real stunning kind of outcome, and that's probably why they are taking so long as well.
And remember, Mark, this is for the part of the project, the environmental impacts in the part of the project not subject to the jurisdiction of the Coastal Commission.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay. Well, I appreciate the updates. Before we adjourn, are there any thoughts about topics for the next committee meeting? Other than, of course, we will continue. What's the feedback? I don't know, some feedback. So obviously we'll continue to follow these items. Anything come to mind as far as topics for next committee meeting?
Nope, I think there will obviously be things that turn up. Good luck tomorrow, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Looks good. So look forward to seeing you guys later.
All right.
Terrific.
Okay, everybody. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you.